Sometimes when we're new to looking at art, we can be intimidated by the belief that we first have to know something about the artist or artwork in order to truly appreciate it. And it's true that knowing something about art history and art media will deepen your experience. In fact, that's much of what we'll be doing in class this semester. But what if I told you that you already possess the ability to have an engaging experience with a work of art? And in this short exercise, we'll discover that by simply describing what we see and how we see it, that we're already well on our way there. We're going to use a painting for this exercise. So before we start, get comfortable and bring your full attention to this image. And in the next 10 seconds, identify at least 3 things that you notice. All right, friends, time is up. So what did you see? Well, of course, there are many ways to answer that question. I'm sure all of you noticed the person standing on the rocks, or others may have noticed the sky or even noted its bluish color. If you thought more in terms of how the picture made you feel, you might have said the scene looked sort of sublime. But how the piece makes us feel is a more complex experience than simply describing what we see. So let's just stick with the work in purely visual terms for now. Generally, we'll identify 2 different categories of things when we're describing an artwork. We'll either describe the artwork's subject matter or its form. In fact, those are the only 2 types of things we can describe in purely visual terms when we're talking about art. Let's go back to our friend on the cliff and take a more detailed look at the work's subject matter and form. This painting is by an artist named Caspar David Friedrich, and it's titled Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog and was painted around 1820. So what else can we see? Let's start with just describing the work's subject matter. And by subject, I mean, what is the scene the painter is depicting? We've already noted the figure generally, but let's look at it in more detail. If we consider conventions for dressing in the early 19th century, along with his haircut, I would guess the figure's gender to be male. And from the title and his walking stick, we're led to believe he's out on a hike. It's worth noting that we can't see his face. It's an interesting point that we'll come back to. We could also note that this work is an example of figurative art, which is any type of art featuring predominantly what? You guessed it, human figures. Aside from the figure, all of the other dominant subjects are tied up with the landscape, such as the rocks, fog, mountains, sky, and clouds. So we might equally be inclined to call this a landscape painting. Perhaps it's not purely landscape, but it is certainly a big part of this picture. If we look closely, we'll be able to make out some textural details, such as trees faintly visible through the fog, and vegetation on the rocky outcropping in the foreground. I also noticed that he echoed the flow of the 3 mountain peaks in the far distance with 3 similar rocky mounds directly under the hiker's forward foot. For me, a lot of visual pleasure in looking at art is simply taking the time to notice moments like these. You can also think of subject matter as what's being represented in the artwork. And the term representational art is commonly used to describe art that has life-like subject matter. But subject matter is only half of what we're seeing. In fact, we wouldn't see subjects at all if it weren't for form. When we describe an artwork's form, we're talking about its physical conditions, meaning how it's made and what it's made of. This could begin broadly by noting the work by media, for example, whether it's a painting or sculpture. Different art media within the same category can have vastly different physical characteristics. So if it were a painting per se, depending on what paint media the artist used, you might notice visual qualities unique to that type of paint. For instance, oil paints tend to be thick and saturated, while watercolors are more liquid-like and translucent. Form also includes the scale of the artwork, which is easy to see if you're actually standing in front of the thing, but notoriously difficult to understand in reproduction. Take our Giacometti sculpture here. From this image alone, it looks like it could be sitting comfortably on your coffee table, when in fact it's almost 6 feet tall. So if you're researching a work online, it never hurts to look up the dimensions, since knowing its scale gives you just that little extra bit of insight. A little bit of research by Googling the artist's last name and artwork title with the words location and dimensions told me that our wanderer friend here is in the collection of the Kunsthalle Hamburg in Hamburg, Germany, and measures about 40 inches by 30 inches. So standing in front of it would be like looking through a small picture window. Form also includes foundational visual components known as the formal elements. And during the semester, we'll spend time investigating each formal element in both writing assignments and in our creative work. The formal elements include line, shape, light, color, depth, texture, pattern, and time, along with composition and design. We'll find some or all of these formal elements present in most artworks to a greater or lesser degree. And when you're talking about an artwork's form, generally it makes sense to begin by describing the one that strikes you the most. The things that I notice first about the Friedrich painting are the colors and its sense of depth. Friedrich splits the palette between the top and bottom half. He uses lots of browns and greens for the earth portion and grays and blues for the sky. The figure's clothing are also a deep velvety green and connect him visually to the colors of the earth, making him feel even more grounded. These lighter, hazier colors in the top portion of the painting create a deep sense of illusionistic space. He uses what's known as atmospheric perspective, painting the mountains in the distance lighter to make them feel farther away from us. Darker colors absorb light. So if we look again at the bottom half, our vision is being grounded with these heavier, darker colors. We might say he's even created a sense of visual gravity by simulating the solidity and heaviness of the rocky surface. Speaking of surface, if we were able to get close enough, we would notice how smooth it actually is. Friedrich handles the brush delicately with no hint of rough or expressive brushstroke. There does appear to be some cracks in the glaze, but that's not uncommon for a painting that's almost 200 years old, especially one whose original surface was so smooth. It's also hard not to notice how the figure is positioned right in the center of the picture plane. It's a conventional triangular composition used in paintings going back to the Renaissance. This not only creates a sense of visual order and balance, it anchors our gaze to the figure. And it's the way the figure is superimposed in the landscape that seems to be the crux of what this painting is about. So what is it? What meaning can we make from this picture? We've already noticed that it's like both a portrait and a landscape, but not fully either. In traditional portraiture, the face is the most important element. In the absence of the face, we have to imagine who the person is and what the expression is. Is our wanderer smiling? Is he crying? We simply have no way of knowing what his emotional response is in this moment. And it's unconventional as a landscape because of the way the figure interrupts this otherwise dramatic vista. So in the absence of his facial expression, or the presence of any other figures giving us cues to what to think or do, we can assume we're meant to step into the shoes of the wanderer ourselves. And in this way, it's easy to start to see this as a metaphor for our own relationship with the natural world, as individuals and possibly even as a species. You'll notice that our conversation about the work has now shifted to the work's content. And what I mean by content are the feelings or ideas about the artwork that fill it with meaning. You will also hear people talk about what the work's intention is, what it symbolizes, or what it stands for. These are all concerned with the artwork's content. Whereas viewers will generally agree on subject matter and form, since those tend to be concerned with literal visual depictions, content will be unique to each of us, and our interpretation of the work's meaning will depend on our individual life experiences and perspectives. For instance, I may look at this image and think about a family trip we took to the Grand Canyon when I was a kid, and the sense of awe and grandeur I felt at that young age. Whereas I recently saw a documentary about a guy who broke his leg while hiking alone and had to drag himself 13 miles before he was found. I think it's very possible this image might recall very different memories for him. Discerning an artwork's content can be one of the most challenging, but also deeply pleasurable parts of looking at art. It's where we're invited to contribute to the creative act. In fact, some artists believe their work isn't complete until it actively engages a viewer. For me, The Wanderer is about being on the precipice of something amazing and terrifying. It makes me think about the moments in my life where I've made the effort to reach the top, only to realize there was still so much farther to go. I find it humbling to think that this experience of life is much more vast and complex than I will ever be able to truly understand from my fixed perspective. So let's recap. In the absence of any prior knowledge about an artwork, when you encounter it for the first time, just spend the first few minutes looking at it. When you're ready, begin by describing a combination of the subject matter, literally what's being depicted, and the form, the physical conditions of the artwork, and the way the subjects are being rendered. We've only scratched the surface on The Wanderer. You could imagine how having more formal terminology and some art historical context could give you way more to talk about. In case you're curious, Caspar David Friedrich was a German painter associated with the period in art known as Romanticism, and we'll see much more of his work again in a couple weeks when we cover this period in the art history component of the course. So to finish up our recap, remember that the work's content or meaning is going to be found in the relationship of the subject matter and form. If you alter either the form or subject matter, you change the content. For example, how does it change the meaning of the picture if the sky suddenly became much more colorful and dramatic? Or if our wanderer was traipsing around the world in kinky boots? We'll end here and leave it open for your interpretation.